A very good evening to you, Your Highness. A very good evening, everybody.
Hi, good evening, Professor Aishwaria. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Your Highness. How about you?
I'm okay. Thanks God. I am feel better.
That's great. So glad to be back. And I see that.
Welcome back to your classroom and to your students.
Thank you so much, Your Highness. Well, we are getting back after a long haul. And it was unfortunate that India got hit by a second wave of coronavirus. And I hope everybody here are in the best of health now. I received messages from so many of my students that, their families, they themselves are going through a very terrible phase. And I hope it's over for everybody for now, but we don't have to drop our precautions at all because there is a looming danger of a third wave. So I hope everybody, is all prepared to face the third challenge and is not dropping any precaution whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, we hope that everybody will be fine. We pray for everybody. And so
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Your Highness. It's been your blessings that everything at my end, at least, my immediate family is okay. Um, and now that I'm back, I wish to have an uninterrupted flow of these sessions to keep the whole momentum going. I will be beginning from where we had left the last time. And with your permission, Your Highness, I would like to start now.
Yes, please. It's your
Right.
classroom. Feel free to start anytime. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Also, I have the permission to share my screen.
Oh, let me verify that immediately. Yes, you have.
Right. Thank you so much. All right, so I hope the screen is visible to everybody. I'm minimizing all the chat boxes and everything so I could read from my slides too. And if there are any questions, I can take it up towards the end of the class. Also, there is a scope for you to post the question in the group that I created on Telegram. So I request that you keep yourself muted throughout so I could have an uninterrupted session. And also towards the end of this class, I would play a brief video. If in case that video is interrupted in any way, if it's pixelated, you can't hear the voice, don't panic. I'll share the PPT with you guys towards the end so you can, have a perusal of it on your own after the session as well. All right. So um, start from the beginning where I had taken off. Remember how I told you about the history of England and how over time it was invaded by different tribes and different people, Picts and Scots and Danes and French people, the Norman conquest, and the French influence coming into England, into English language also. And then we had discussed Hundred Years' War, War of the Roses. We had briefly discussed about how powerful church was back in that time, and how literature pivoted around the subjects that were concerning religion, because church was the supreme authority, supreme power, and whatever it felt necessary was the theme of the writers of those times, because the church, the monasteries, they were actually the centers of learning. And if they felt something was inappropriate for circulation, they did not encourage it much. So there was less of secular thought in the writings back in those times. And then suddenly, not suddenly, but gradually, with authors, writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, there was a little shift towards, common life of people, with Canterbury Tales coming into picture, and wherein we find so many pilgrims coming together for one journey towards the shrine of Sir Thomas Becket. And it was then that during that journey, different stories were told, and together they were clubbed into the Canterbury Tales. And it is, uh, a very defining feature of English, of the history of English literature, because it was with that English, in a way, the stabilized version of it came out. It was Chaucer who, took up a dialect, East Midland dialect, and turned it into a language that we have English today. English, of course, it was very different back in those times from the English that we speak today. But then, it was the point from where everything had started. So we had gone through all of those details in the previous 4 lectures. So I remember, uh, I had spoken about the Tudor timeline, and going through a brief background of how the Tudor period was, the early Tudor period. I will take that up shortly again when I start Elizabethan era. So all those details, they get brushed up again. So I remember I left somewhere at Sir Thomas Wyatt. Okay, so if you remember, I mentioned that after Chaucer, there were many writers that came, but their work was not very promising. So the era right after Chaucer was of very, um, it did not have a very substantial literary output that period. But it is important to study that period. Why? Because it sort of became a preparatory ground for something grand to come into picture. And we know what that grand, what is that grand era that I'm talking about? That is, of course, the Elizabethan era. And we see it was during the Elizabethan era, the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. It was during her reign that we had Shakespeare working his magic, writing and dramatizing plays. And I hope I am audible to everybody.
Yes, please.
Right, great. So it then becomes important for us to study a few poets that actually, their work, it served as a, their contribution was seminal work, and whatever they had uh, planted came to fruition during the Elizabethan period, right? And so one very important figure in the early Tudor period was Sir Thomas Wyatt, and it is said that with him, modern English poetry begins. And why is this figure so important for us to study? Because he brought in several foreign models, and he experimented with a great variety of lyric measures. Just like Chaucer, he too was sent on a foreign mission. He went to Italy, and from there, whenever you are traveling to a place, you get inspired, and when you come back from that place, you carry that influence with you. This happened with Chaucer. When he traveled to France, he brought back, the courtly romances. When he traveled to Italy, he brought the influences of, Italian writers. And such a thing happened with Sir Thomas Wyatt as well. He traveled out, he traveled to Italy, and what he brought back was the sonnet form. So yes, Sir Thomas Wyatt, he was responsible for bringing the sonnet form into English, right? So that makes him a very important figure to be studied. And he brought into the English poetry a combination of flexibility and regularity, which was lost in the century following Chaucer. So, the writers that immediately followed Chaucer, they were very their writing was very dull. And it felt, if you go through the poetry of those writers, you feel that, they are putting in a lot of labor, they're laboring out lines. It's not coming out naturally. And, there is, it's lacking in that essence that one would find in Chaucer's works. So, um, the writers of those times, they these poets, they used to borrow and imitate and translate from Italian and French sources, and they even used to get inspired from each other, and they used to, you know uh, borrow influences, so to say. So that was the time when we have Sir Thomas Wyatt in the picture. And like I mentioned, like Chaucer, he was also sent on a diplomatic mission abroad and had visited Italy, where he came under the spell of the 14th century Italian poet. And that Italian poet was Francesco Petrarca, very popularly known as Petrarch, right? And Petrarch, is considered the great master of sonnets, of idealized love. We will get to the conception of the idealized love shortly. So just hang in there. So sonnet, even though it came into England in the early Tudor period, that was the early 16th century, it was already there in Italy in the 12th century, 12th, 13th century. And the sonnet form, the sonnet, as a mode, it originated in Italy. It first moved to France and then came to England. So, there is this westward movement of influences, something that I had mentioned in the previous lectures as well. A movement originates somewhere, in the relatively eastern part of Europe, and then it moves to France, and then it comes to England. Uh, you know, Moving through the map. If you see the map, France is in the middle, Italy will be on your right, and towards left there'll be the British Isles. So this is a westward movement of the influences. So this is how even sonnets, they had a westward movement, and they came to sonnets as a form, it came to England with Sir Thomas Wyatt, right? So for those of you who do not know what sonnets are, they are actually poems of 14 lines, right? And there are two types of sonnets. One is, of course, the original version of it, the Italian sonnet. And, when it came to England, this sonnet form, it got adapted. The English poets, they experimented with the form, the structure, and the content of it. And then we have the emergence of the English sonnets, right? And structurally, the Italian sonnet and the English sonnets are a bit different. In what terms? I'll tell you. See, Italian sonnets, we know sonnets have 14 lines, but the division of it marks whether it is an Italian or English, right? So an Italian sonnet, like you can see on the screen, it has an octave, that is a coupling together of 8 lines, that has focus on one stance or a proposition, whatever the poet is talking about. Then, in the middle somewhere comes what is called a volta. Volta is, a line that would, change the whole direction of the poem, right? It would just invert it completely. And then what follows in the remaining 6 lines of the sonnet is, the sestet. That is what, the coupling of 6 lines of, that is what it's called, sestet. And the focus here is completely different from what was being spoken about in the octave, right? So we have an octave and we have a sestet. And the line that marks a shift in the tone, a shift in the expression of feeling or whatever, a shift in the content, that is called the volta, right? And in English sonnet, which is also called the Elizabethan sonnet, and this is also the sonnet form that was taken up by Shakespeare, and so it is also called Shakespearean sonnet, we have 3 quatrains, right? That is a coupling together of 4 lines each, and then towards the end we have a couplet, right? So this is how the structuring of an Italian sonnet and an English sonnet differs. So one has to keep in mind the distinction, because This distinction is important from exam point of view, especially when you're sitting for an examination like NET or SET, right? So a little bit about Petrarchan sonnets. They had certain features, Petrarchan sonnets, which came into English sonnets. And before we get to what English poets do to the sonnets and how they were different from the Petrarchan sonnets, we first have to understand the details as to what Petrarch was putting into his sonnets. What was the content? To whom was this? Were these sonnets addressed? So as the name itself is suggestive, they were named after the Italian poet Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch, popularly known as Petrarch. And he was a lyrical poet of 14th century Italy. And it is interesting to note that Petrarch was not the person who invented this form. He was the one who popularized it. So it was someone else who actually invented this form, the sonnet form. And the name of that person is Giacomo da Lentini. And he used the Sicilian dialect. Sicily is a place in Italy. And it is that dialect that was first used in the making of sonnets, right? So it was back in 13th century that Giacomo Lentini was writing. He first invented the sonnet form, which is very important. Petrarch was the one who popularized it. So, like I had mentioned previously, the lines are divided into 8-line subsection that is called an octave, and it is followed by 6-line subsection, which is called sestet, right? And there is a specific rhyme scheme that this octave follows, and that is ABBA, ABBA, which means the first, the fourth, the fifth, and the 8 lines will have a similar rhyme, and the second, the third, sixth, and seventh lines will have similar rhyme, right? You know how the rhyming scheme works, right? So this was ABBA, ABBA, right? And there was this another variant in Petrarchan sonnets that is called Cribing, which contains a different rhyme scheme for the opening octave, which is ABBA, CDDC. So if there is a different rhyme scheme in the next 4 lines, we know that variant is the Cribing, right? This name might be new to you, but you need to remember this. It is important to remember, all right? And just like octave, even sestet, it follows one of the 2 rhyme schemes. And the more common scheme that a sestet in a sonnet follows is that, CDE, CDE, right? Where the 9th and the 12th and 13th and 11th and the 14 lines, they rhyme, right? So this is the rhyming scheme. And this is the most common scheme for sestet, CDE, CDE. But there is another rhyming scheme also, that is CDC, CDC, where there is a repetition of the previous rhyme. And this particular rhyme scheme, where there is a repetition in sestet, is called the Sicilian sestet, right? And it is named for the dialect used by Petrarch himself. So Petrarch himself was using that sestet rhyming scheme, right? The Sicilian sestet. So you need to bear these details in mind. These are some technical details, but otherwise, if you read sonnets, they have a totally different feeling to it. But if you get down to technicalities, these are the things that you have to bear in mind. All right, so a little bit about the nature of Petrarch's poetry. So, the central event in Petrarch's poetry was his unrequited love, unfulfilled, unattainable love for his mistress. Who was that mistress? It was Laura, who was an idealized woman whose name he was to immortalize in his 317 sonnets, compiled under the title Rime in Vita Immorta di Madonna Laura, or you could, simply call it Il Canzonieri, which came out in 1327, right? So Laura immortalized in Petrarch's sonnets. And, there is this, Petrarch's unattainable beloved, this woman, Laura, she became a definitive model for the construction of the beautiful pedestalized mistress in the love poetry of Elizabethan age. So, this image of Laura, who was a woman, was unattainable, belongs to a different world altogether. And, she became the model for so many writers, so many Elizabethan writers, poets, right? And throughout this work, Il Canzonieri, Laura is depicted by Petrarch as being in possession, this is important, being in possession of both outer and inner beauty. And in her perfection, she was seen as helping the male poet slash lover in accessing the divine. So there is this association of love with divinity, right? There is this idea of platonic love, because obviously that love is never consummated because there is never a physical contact with Laura. So she is a celestial being. And through her presence, the poet can access the secrets, the blessings of divinity, right? So it is a pedestalized love, love that is, you know, on a pedestal, something that is revered, something that is idealized, right? And it has its roots, the whole treatment of Laura, it has its roots in the philosophy of Neo-Platonism. You remember how Plato spoke about our world, this world, being imperfect, and there is this another metaphysical world where everything is perfect, right? So this Laura is from that other world. It's from that perfect metaphysical world, right? And, you know, it was believed that the ultimate divine beauty of the metaphysical world manifests itself as material beauty in the body of the beloved. So the body of the beloved, the presence of the beloved, then, it is actually a proof of that perfect beauty that exists in the other world, right? So there is this Platonic idea of the woman, of the beloved, coming from a different world altogether. She is stellar, like if you read Astrophil Stella, Sidney has written in this fashion using Petrarch's model, where his beloved is unattainable. It is seen that it is fair that she's married, so she can actually not, their love, the poet and the beloved, they can actually not consummate their love. So it is impossible to think of a union, right? So there is this idea of platonic love associated with Laura. And while speaking about his beloved, the lover himself presents, he himself presents himself as a humble servant of an often cruel, fair, wounded by the glance of her eye, tempest tossed in the seas of despair when his love is rejected, changing in mood according to the presence or the absence of his beloved. These are the moods that these sonnets express, that when he gets rejected, when the poet gets rejected, the lover gets rejected, he feels dismayed, right? And the presence makes the poet cheerful. The absence of his beloved brings despair into his life. And it is all based on the medieval courtly love tradition, right? Something that we would also find in Romance of the Rose, which was written around Chaucer's time, right? So this is, the expression of platonic love towards Laura that Petrarch was talking about. And the Petrarchan sonnets, then provided the English poets with both a conventional form and conventional sentiment also. So it was the form and it was the content also. So it was not just borrowing of the structure of those 14 lines, but also how the lover, how the beloved is treated in the course of the poetry, right? So this is Petrarchan sonnets. And if you have read Edmund Spencer's sonnet, you would see that how different it is from what Petrarch has written. Why? Because he is talking in those sonnets. He talks about his beloved, uh, who is evasive, who escapes him often again, and then eventually, there is this union of the two lovers, because we know that he marries his beloved. So there is this coming together. So, Spencer's beloved does not belong to another world, is not attainable. In English sonnets, see, this is how experimentation worked in English literature. In English version of it, the lover becomes accessible, at least in Spencer's work. Although in Philip Sidney's work, the beloved is still unattainable. So there was a lot of experimentation with form. And often, the poet would go on to tell about their courtly life as well, right? So in the process of expressing their love for their beloved, they would tell a great deal about their personal life, about their courtly life, in the whole process. So these were the features of Petrarchan sonnets, which you need to bear in mind. And you can then juxtapose it with the English versions of the sonnet form, right? Now, another important figure that needs, that is worth a mention is Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, right? He was executed in 1547 on a trumped up charge of treason. That during those times, it was just easy to uh, accuse anybody of treason and have that person beheaded. And a little bit about his background, though. He was born in the noblest families of England, the reason he was Earl of Surrey. So he came from a noble family, and he was educated in both English and French courts. And consciously, he was brought up in an aristocratic tradition, obviously, because he was born into a good, noble family. So Surrey, as a writer, was more successful than Wyatt in terms of metrical composition, but lacks Wyatt's moving and surprising touches, right? So Wyatt's work had more vitality, but when it came to handling metrical arrangements, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, was uh, far, far better than Wyatt, right? And much of Surrey's verse handles the traditional Petrarchan theme of love, right? And so most interesting are his autobiographical pieces, such as the poems in alternately rhyming iambic pentameter lines, which he wrote on his temporary imprisonment in Windsor in 1545. So he spoke about a lot, uh, he spoke a lot about his personal affairs, there is this coming into the coming of autobiographical element into the sonnet form, and he experimented with what we know as Poulter's measure. So this was we don't find it very often in English compositions and poetry, but this is something that is worth a mention. It is a form, a meter that actually became popular in the 16th century. And it was a meter in which lines of 12 and 14 syllables, they alternate, right? And poulter is an obsolete variant of a poulterer or a poultry dealer. And poulterers traditionally gave one or two eggs extra when selling by the dozen. So, the idea of 12 plus 2 coming in, the reason it's called poulter's measure, right? And the couplets in which a 12 syllable iambic line rhymes with 14 syllable it was actually a couple, ending the poetry. It used to end with the couplet, and throughout the couplet, which had 12 syllable iambic lines. You know what iambs are: unstressed syllables followed by stressed syllables. We've been through this, right? And a repetition of such that this pattern, unstressed followed by stress, if it happens 6 times, that becomes not 6 times, it actually 12 syllable iambic line and it has 14 iambic line, that is the 14er, right? So just remember that it's Poulter's measure. This might get a little difficult for you. So Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, he introduced what we know as Porter's measure, right? And the most pioneering achievement, the most overarching achievement of Henry Howard was the use of blank verse. So he was the guy who brought into English literature blank verse, which was so profusely used by the writers that were to come, Christopher Marlowe, Shakespeare, even Milton. They profusely used blank verse. And it was him, actually, Henry Howard, who introduced, who interjected uh, this form into the English literature, right? And but where was this? Where he used blank verse? So it was in the translation of the second and the fourth book of Virgil's Aeneid, right? So it was there that he brought into English literature blank verse, right? Blank verse is unrhymed iambic pentameter lines, right? So if they are not rhyming, that means they are blank verse. So another important work from early Tudor period is what we know as Tottle's Miscellany, right? In 1557, after the death of Wyatt and Surrey, the printer Richard Tottle, what he did, he put a collection of poetry by the courtly makers, these writers, Wyatt, Surrey, since they were writing about love, they were writing sonnets. Sonnets largely were love poetries. So they were called the courtly makers, and so this guy Richard Tottle, he put together the works of Wyatt, Surrey, and other contemporaries, lesser known contemporaries, and he titled it Songs and Sonnets, written by Right Honorable Lord Henry Howard, late Earl of Surrey, and others. And this book is generally known as Tottle's Miscellany, right? I think it is the first time that you're coming across a name like that, Tottle's Miscellany, but yes, it is the collection where you would find Wyatt's and Surrey's works and works of other contemporaries of those times, early Tudor period. And in this collection, the first 36 poems are by Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, and 4 more incorporated later. So 36 and 4, that would make 40 of his poems, and 91 by Wyatt, and 40 by this poet named Nicholas Grimald, and 94 pieces attributed to uncertain authors. So there are several poems in this collection that are anonymously printed, and this is the collection where you would find their poetry, right? Now, another important, very important, in fact, work from that period, early Tudor period, was Mirror for Magistrates. Now, what exactly was this work? The most ambitious, this was actually the most ambitious single poetic achievement of the mid 16th century England, and it was a didactic work. What is didactic? Something that tells you this is good, this is bad. You need to do this, you need to do that, right? So it was didactic in nature, but what exactly did it do? It was actually a collection of the history of eminent personalities from politics. It was their stories, and through those stories, uh, contemporary readers were told, see, this is what you need to do, and this is what you need to stay away from. So it was didactic work in that sense, all right, and which was intended originally as a continuation of Lydgate's Fall of Princes. uh, you remember I mentioned this text, Fall of Princes, where there is a collection of stories, of collection of histories of all the kings who failed to rule good, failed to have an impact in politics. They just could not make it as good rulers. So Fall of Princes, right? So it is actually a continuation of that, Mirror for Magistrates, right? So, and itself, the work Lydgate's Fall of Princes, it was inspired from Boccaccio's Cassibus virorum illustrum, right? So again, there is this Italian influence coming in. And what this work had, it is actually a collection of imaginary monologues spoken by the ghosts of eminent men, right? So there are these ghosts of bygone people. They are speaking, they're having a monologue.
Oh,
And
wow.
men who suffer drastic reversal of fortune, right? Uh, tragedy back in those times was not, somebody getting killed or anything of such, gory scale.
I don't know.
A reversal of fortune. So this is exactly, what happens in Mirror for Magistrates. The ghosts of these eminent, people, they come, they speak, and they tell what led to their downfall. And then becomes a lesson for the readers that, see, I had done this, so this happened to me, so you have to stay away from this. You should not indulge into this. This led to my fall. So it was didactic in that sense, right? And the stories in this collection, they were linked by prose discussions among the authors, where they exchange views about the significance of the stories they tell. So, even the authorial voice is coming into picture. And they talk about ethical and political concerns, ideas, that underlie, that act as a bedrock for this whole philosophical discussion. And the most effective ways of presenting them, thus showing themselves concerned both with technical problems of their craft and with the intellectual currents of their times. So they, these authorial voices, they speak amongst themselves as to, they have a conversation regarding ethical ideas, what is ethical, what is not, and political ideas, but they are also concerned about the form of literature, right? And it embodies the Renaissance interest in the didactic aspect of history, in the study of the past as proper education of the prince, teaching him by example what to follow and what to avoid. So didactic in that sense, that it tells people that, these are the models that you need to follow to stay on the right path, to, avoid reversal of fortune. But if you were to follow a certain regime, a certain decadent, practice, nobody can save you from a downfall. So, didactic in that sense. Mirror for magistrates. The magistrates, they can look into the mirror, they can look into the lives of other people and learn, right? So, and the authors in this collection, they're actually concerned with the nature of order of justice, what it means to, what is justice and what it means to serve justice, with the reasons of human suffering, with the ways in which divine retribution overtakes human crimes, and with cause and effect in human affairs. All are the, all these features you would find in this collection. And this book, it concerns itself with proper behavior between the ruler and the ruled, that how the ruler needs to behave and how the subjects, how his subjects, his or her subjects need to behave, right? So it concerns itself with behavior. So it is a handbook of proper behavior, one can say, right? And it takes characters from English history, from the time of Richard II to Henry VIII, right? And it seeks to project a moral and educational meaning of history. That, if you read history, it has certain very potent lessons to give to you. So it validates the claim of history as a very important undertaking, reading and knowing of history, right? And the notion of history as a greater teacher was common in Renaissance, which got reiterated in the 16th century literature, which you would also find in Mirror for Magistrates. And it also reinterpreted the medieval concept of the wheel of fortune and unpredictable fate to show the political and ethical background of those spectacular falls from high estate which the Middle Ages saw as tragedy. So tragedy, like I said, was not killing of a person. It was just, a fall from high to low estate, right? And the Tudor historians, Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed, from whom Shakespeare drew the materials for his history plays. So these are important figures, Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed. Um, you know, they shared this Renaissance view of function of history. So in their dealing with history, in their writings, you would find that sentiment that history is a teacher, right? And because Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed were the writers which were referred by Shakespeare for his historical plays, somewhere the didactic feature of Mirror for Magistrate, the didactic feature didactic feature of history, the teaching function of history, which was very popular in the Renaissance time, it also seeps into the works of Shakespeare. So, this is how influences they channel in, right? And Shakespeare's Coriolanus, Richard III, and, Henry IV, they are actually intersections, conjunctions of politics, morality, and even psychology, right? So this uh, text then assumes importance in the sense that, it brings, it keeps on the table those ideas, those philosophies that were to be found later in the writers, in the works of the writers of Elizabethan period, right? So switching on to another slide, I will stop sharing this and I would share another PPT with you guys now. So before we actually get into the discussion of Elizabethan era, it is imperative for us to understand the English Reformation, the creation of Anglican Church, the English Church. What were the circumstances that led to its creation? All the politics and all the drama that circles around this episode. It is important for us to know, right? So just a brief background before we start discussing the English Reformation. We all know that, Elizabethan era, it is said to be the golden era of English literature. And this era, it actually spans for over 67 years. And it began with the ascension of Queen Elizabeth I that took place in 1558. And this period, it stretched on to the time of death of King James I, right? Which happened in 1625. So I know there is an overlap of two different periods because these are the periods of two different monarchs, but there was a continuity in the writing style. So, we can say that, it was roughly 67 years during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and also during the reign of King James I. Although, towards the end of King James I, the period of King James I, all this were on a decline, something that we are going to discuss in the coming sessions. So there are actually two stages that you need to understand in this whole discussion. The first is the beginning 21 years of Queen Elizabeth's reign. That is the first stage, right? And that is seen as a stage of preparation for the grand writers to come in. That was towards the end of the Elizabethan era that we see Shakespeare at his best. We see Edmund Spenser at his best. We have Marlowe. He came and then he died. He had a very brief literary career, but then his works are very important, right? And there were other writers also, Robert Greene, George Peele, and the names you will get familiarized with in the course of our discussion, because I'm going to pick this up again. So the first initial years, it is phase one, and then we have the next phase, the next 24 years, which is between the publication of Spenser's Faerie Queene until the period of Queen's death, right? So that is stage two, right? And this period saw the full fruition of the Elizabethan period, right? Towards the end, it was then the time when Romeo and Juliet, The Tempest, Antony and Cleopatra, they all came into picture towards the end of the Elizabethan period, right? And historians later on designated this period as the golden age of Britain. We all know why, because it was the time when the best of the writers were composing their works, something that were to, the works that were to gain canonical importance with time to come, right? And all these features, all these writings that came to fruition during Elizabeth's time, they all were on a decline during James I's period, right? And Elizabethan period was a period of relatively political stability, yes, and because Elizabeth I's father, Henry VIII, he is a very controversial figure of history. We are going to get to him shortly. And I just have 15 minutes left. I need to buck up, I think. Your Highness, can I have a spillover session if I take 10, 15 minutes extra today? Will it be okay?
No problem for me.
All right, great. Thank you so much. All right. So, okay. This was a period of relative political stability. Why? Because there was a lot of upheaval during the reign of Elizabeth's father, that is Henry VIII, right? So, as per John Guy, a recent historian, England was economically healthier, right? There was a lot of money coming in. Uh, it was more expensive than before and more optimistic, more nationalistic during Elizabethan period. And under the Tudors, the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII, Henry VIII, and Edward VI, and Mary I, Elizabeth I. This is the whole line, the Tudor line. So during this Tudor dynasty, uh, England experienced its best time, right? So, but we need to, wind the clocks back and to understand the political upheavals of the early Tudor period, of the political, upheavals to some extent, this political dissension that went on even in the Elizabethan period, we need to understand Protestant Reformation. And this Protestant Reformation is actually recognized as a turning point in world history. Why? Because people began to see profound effects of religion and politics in common life. So religion was already intertwined with everyday life. We all know. We've seen that in Chaucer's time as well, when he was writing Canterbury. Even before Chaucer's time, church was of supreme importance, and it had a great deal of impact on common people, right? But coming together, there was it was this time when politics and religion, they got enmeshed, right? So terribly bad. I'll tell you how. Now, in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was the most powerful, right? And in terms of religion, political matters, and financial matters, we had gone through this detail. And Catholic Church was the head of the church, right? And head of religion was an assigned political head of each, right? And they were in control. These heads who were assigned to different states, they had control of the economy of that particular region of which they were, heads. So they were the ones with the largest holding of land, these church people, and they had colossal amount of resources available to them. So they had appropriated for themselves a lot of financial strength. They had political strength as well. And obviously, through religion, they were controlling everybody, right? And during that time, there was a widespread, there was, a great spike in economic scandals and controversies, which had something to do with the luxurious life that, these monasteries, these monks, and these people from church, they were leading. This is something that we find in Chaucer's Canterbury Tale as well. The monk is so, he's dressed in expensive clothes and his boots, and they're all very luxurious, too luxurious for a monk to don. So it indirectly hints at the corruption of the church, right? So the church also claimed, uh, there is a little repetition in my text here. Sorry, I forgot editing it. So it claimed the control to the keys of the kingdom of heaven. So if you need salvation, you have to go through church, right? So, it had become an intermediary between the people and God. So if you have any desire of salvation, you will have to go through church, this intermediary. And then it is only through church that you can reach God. So this was how, the equation was. And common people were either scared, even though, they were aware of all these scandals and all the corruption that was going about in the church. They were either scared to go against church, or they were not, sufficiently equipped. They did not have that thinking skills. They were not equipped for a rebellion, right? So, this was the predicament of the people of those times. And before the Protestant Reformation began to sweep over Europe, people started questioning all these practices. It started questioning the role of church in religion. And there was this time, during this Reformation period, that, this sentiment, it was sweeping all over Europe. We see, I'll be discussing certain, intellectual people who were responsible for bringing in this thought process. We have Wycliffe, we have Martin Luther, right? So we're eventually coming to that. So what happened was that, this sentiment was sweeping over Europe and other related parts, and it had a great impact on the socio-political conditions of those times. And everything was turning against church. Things were going unfavorable for the church. And the two events that, brought in a sense of distress in people, a distrust in church, the two events, those were the Renaissance and the Black Death. See, Renaissance was the event that fostered a spirit of critical inquiry, critical thinking, into matters of religion and, pagan ways of thinking, going back to pre-Christian era, right? So it presented people with an alternative vantage point to see a thing from a different perspective altogether. This was enabled by the Renaissance, right? And Black Death, it, pushed people on the edge, right? It actually led people to a life of dissolution, forcing them to question the ways in which they were leading their life and the questions about what happens after death. People started getting inquisitive, and Bible was not accessible by common people because it was not in vernacular language, and Latin, it was in Latin, and Latin was could only be read by the monks, right? And the clergy people, the church people, right? So um, there was also, then several people came up, they translated Bible into vernacular. There was a lot of hullabaloo around these episodes. And there were also a lot of internal disagreements while, the common people were already, questioning. Even the people on the inside of the church, even they had disagreements with, the power structure of the Catholic Church. And in the 13th and the 14th century, there were almost three popes who were getting replaced one after the another. Why? Because they could not arrive at an agreement as to who should hold the power. And there was this whole constant shifts within the institution of the church, which led to instability, right? And also even the clergy were getting increasingly disappointed with the way the church was functioning. So a distress outside, the common people, they were questioning the ways. There was this a sense of disagreement within the church itself by what path, what trajectory it's going on, right? And so there was a call to return to Bible, because Bible is the book that has the word of God. And it is Bible which also forms one of the key principles around which the Reformation is framed. So there was this act that the whole act of Reformation, this was to bring back Catholic Church on the track from which it had diverted, which it was just seen as a coach that just went off the rails. And Reformation, what it did was to bring that coach back on the tracks, right? So this was Reformation. And many thinking people, the clergy, and also the ones who had access to the word of God, that is Bible, they began to realize that there is a huge mismatch, there is a huge discrepancy between what the Bible has to say and the processes and the functioning of the Catholic Church, right? So Reformation, what it intended to do, it just intended to close that gap between Bible and the Catholic Church, right? And the Protestant Reformation began with an intention to reform the Catholic Church. And when we talk about Protestant Reformation, in the earlier stages, there was no intention. It did not have an objective in mind to overthrow the Catholic Church, which happened eventually in England, right? And but eventually, the Protestant Reformation, it ended up replacing Catholic faith with the Protestant faith, right? In England, it was the replacement of the Catholic Church with Anglican Church, English Church. So the Catholic Church was replaced by a English church. And this is what English Reformation is. Now, there are certain circumstances that led to this replacement, right? And to which we would get, we will get to those details shortly. But before we get to that, it's important to consider these figures, these intellectual forces that were responsible for shaping the Protestant Reformation. Number one, John Wycliffe. He questioned the ways in which the church was working. He was a very controversial figure. He died in 1384, and he was declared a heretic by the church much after his death in 1415. So you see the amount of influence, the amount of power that church has, that it has the ability to control people's lives, even when they're alive and even when they're dead, right? So this is the amount of control church had. And, they were very unhappy with the turn of events, because John Wycliffe was someone who had brought the Bible closer to their own language. So he was the one who had translated Bible into vernacular English, right? And he had to go through a set of series of controversial events, and certain controversial thinking patterns were introduced into his version of Bible, which were to spark controversy in future, right? So John Wycliffe was one important figure. And then we have another important figure, Martin Luther. Do not confuse him with Martin Luther King of America, of the Black movement. No, that Martin Luther King is different, and Martin Luther is a different figure altogether. All right. So this Martin Luther, he's actually the key figure in Protestant Reformation. He actually became an inspiration to many in Europe, as well as later within Britain. He was actually a German monk, and he grew very increasingly unhappy with the sale of indulgences. Remember Canterbury Tales where, the partner is selling pardons, that, if you give this much amount, you will, you will get salvation, you will be absolved from your sins, so on and so forth. So, he was very, uh, he grew very unhappy with this practice of selling indulgences, and, which was happening in the Catholic Church. And, this was how church was interfering with the act of forgiveness that the Bible and the God had professed. As per Bible, if you have faith, if you repent, you can have forgiveness. But here, what the Catholic Church was doing, it was selling indulgences, which was, just not acceptable to Martin Luther, right? So he tried to convince the people of earthly authorities that, whatever you're doing is not right. And, at the same time, he had the power, sorry, yeah, he had a conversation, but it did not go well, because the church, the whole institution was very corrupt in itself, and they would not listen. Who would want a stoppage in the flow of income, right? So this corruption grew out of proportion. The whole thing just blew out of proportion, that no one could really had the power to contain it or reform it, right? So he began to find contradictions in the teachings of the Bible and the church practices. He started pointing out, see, this is what is written in the Bible, and this is what the church is doing, which is so different from what the Lord has told us. He started pointing out, and, you know, he realized that the Bible taught forgiveness through faith and grace. And on the contrary, what the church was doing, it was selling forgivenesses, right? Which was totally a corrupt practice, because everything was so monetary, right? And when he saw this discrepancy, when he pointed out these discrepancies, he started acting provocatively. And how did he act? He wrote a book. He came up with 95 theses against the sale of papal indulgences, which came out in 1570. And it was an inaugural moment of the Protestant Reformation, because the masses got informed what the Bible was saying and what the church was doing, right? So there was this mass uprising, and there was this, disillusionment with what the church was doing, and people were wanting change. People were wanting a reform, right? Were wanting to get rid of these corruptive practices of church. And it was Martin Luther King who pinpointed these discrepancies. And another important, I have put in for you guys a link which you can visit later to learn more about Martin Luther. And then we have another important figure, William Tyndale. This guy, William Tyndale, he was burned to death in 1535 for being a Protestant and for being quite proactive in the ways in which he was critiquing the church. He was the one who he was also the one who translated Bible into vernacular, and for this he was burned. Imagine. So what books we have available at our disposal today, people have died for it. So never take your books for granted. So, he was the one who had translated Bible from the original Hebrew and Greek by paying a lot of attention to the nuances of the old text itself. So, in the process of translation, the essence is not lost. He made sure. And, very ironically, he was killed. He was burned to death. And, yet his work was picked up when King James I Bible was being composed. Imagine. What was the need to kill a bright person, a very thoughtful and profound person like him? But it was seen as a treason, right? And he was burned because of that. And then another important figure was another, Renaissance humanist, Erasmus, a Dutch monk. He rejected Catholic monasticism, though he was not directly influential in socio-political history of Europe. He was not directly involved in politics, but then he was the one who rejected Catholic monasticism, and he was a very important literary figure. So if, an important figure, if he rejects something, people follow suit. So he was influential in that sense. His writings and his thoughts began to turn the ways in which the church was getting fashioned and refashioned within Britain. See, this is a repetition here, right? So he was writing about all these changes that were taking place in church, how the church was fashioning because of this whole Reformation process. And there is this saying about the English Reformation that England was very slow to question the established church, but when it finally did, it broke away from that church. Why? Because English church came into picture. It replaced the Roman Catholic faith, right? It took the center stage, the English church. Now, the English Reformation, an in-depth reading of that. See, English Reformation is actually closely bound up with the personal affairs of this very controversial king, that is King Henry VIII, who was also the father of Queen Elizabeth I. And to begin with, he was a very, he was a very strict defender of the Catholic faith and the church. But what happened that led him to create the Church of England? So for this, we will have to wind the clocks back, go back into history, and see where it all started. So you remember how I told you that there was this War of the Roses where two different houses of English, royalty, they were battling amongst themselves as to who is going to come on the throne, who's going to be in power. So, that was the War of the Roses. And War of the Roses, it came to an end with the marriage of Henry Tudor, who belonged to the House of Lancaster, represented by a white rose. He actually married Elizabeth of York, who obviously she belonged from the House of York, which was, the House of York, they used the symbol of a red rose. So when, these two roses, they came together in matrimony, Tudor dynasty, was born. And this Henry Tudor, he became the first Tudor monarch. He became Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII, right? And this king, Henry VII, he was raised and exiled in France, and he comes over to take control of the crown of England. And we know even France was largely Roman Catholic, right? So he was also Roman Catholic. England back then was also Roman Catholic. It was with Henry VIII's personal affairs that English church came into picture, right? So this Henry VII, who married Elizabeth of York, they bore 4 children. The eldest was Prince Arthur. He was the eldest son who died, in his youth. He was not very old. He had barely just married Catherine of Aragon, a princess of Spain. And to that detail, I will get back. And then the second born was Margaret of Scotland. She was the second born child, and she got married to King James IV of Scotland, right? So King James I, who came after Elizabeth I's death, he was actually a cousin of Queen Elizabeth I. He was the son of Margaret of Scotland, right? So a grandson of Henry VII coming into picture after Elizabeth I, right? So the third born kid was Mary, the Queen of France. She got married to Louis XII of France later. And then we have the youngest child, the most notorious, Henry, Duke of Richmond, who also came to be known as Henry VIII, the youngest child. And, he took the crown after Henry VII. Why? Because Arthur had died while, their father was still alive. And so he was the only surviving son. So after Henry VII, Henry VIII, that is Henry, Duke of Richmond, he took over, right? And there was a certain chain of fateful events that led to the creation of English church. What was that? See, Arthur dies quite early in life. And I told you that he married Catherine of Aragon. Aragon is in Spain, so she was a Spanish princess, right? So she was obviously widowed. And under the instruction of his father, Henry VIII, uh, Henry VII, the father Henry VII, Henry VIII married the widow of his elder brother, that is Catherine of Aragon, right? So Henry VIII is married to Catherine of Aragon for about 20 years, and they have a daughter, Mary I, which is who is also known as Bloody Mary. That is perhaps the name of the drink comes from, because Mary I was quite a ruthless ruler. So they have a daughter, Mary I, who was born in 1516. So Catherine of Aragon, she was unable to produce a male heir. She had a series of miscarriages, and she had stillborn babies, and even one son was born out of that wedlock, but that kid did not make it beyond 52 days of his life. So there was no male heir uh, when uh, when King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon were together. No male heir, which actually created a lot of unrest in Henry VIII's mind, because back in those days it was important to have a male heir. So Henry VIII was increasingly upset. He was growing increasingly upset about the fact that he did not have a male heir with Catherine. And uh, at one point, he gets interested in another woman, Anne Boleyn. So this Anne Boleyn was actually a lady of waiting of Catherine of Aragon. And to Anne Boleyn, she played hard to get, and she was like, if you want me, you will have to marry me. So Henry VIII now wants to divorce Catherine of Aragon in order to marry Anne of Boleyn. So there were two reasons why he was wanting to do this. Number one, he fell out of love with Catherine. And also, number two, he did not have, Catherine of Aragon could not provide him with a male heir. That was creating a lot of pressure on him. So he saw this as an opportunity for getting a male heir from a different woman, Anne Boleyn, right? So, he goes to the Pope with a divorce plea. And we all know that, in Roman Catholic faith, divorce is not allowed. So, Henry VIII's plea of a divorce was rejected by the Pope. But then this Henry the Eighth, sorry, it is Henry the Eighth all along, not four. Please remember, I'm just mixing the words. Henry the Eighth was not the type of king who would take no for an answer, and he tried many different ways to convince the Pope, convince the Church that please let me just let me marry Anne Boleyn, let me divorce Catherine, because she was already my brother's she was married to my brother, and perhaps I must have committed sin by marrying my brother's wife, the reason I could not have a male heir, so please let me divorce her. But then they were repeatedly rejected, and the church, because was not convinced, it was not allowed in Roman Catholic faith. So what did he do? Henry VIII, he finds a very convenient way. He decides to completely break away from the Catholic Church. He takes the headship of the state. He creates his own church, the English Church, the Anglican Church, and he marries Anne of Boleyn. So this is how English Church came into picture, came into being, right? And it was at this time that all the Reformation ideas that were in the air because of whatever debates were going on about bringing in changes in church practices to align them all to Bible. All of this was circulating in the air, and all of this came in handy during the creation of Anglican Church, right? And this also gave him a chance to legitimize that, okay, I am doing this because the Catholic Church, it was corrupt and something had to be done about it, right? So now, now we know that Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn. So was it a happily ever after? No. Over a period of a very, over a period of some 3 years, a very brief period, the king gets increasingly upset about the life of Anne Boleyn. He accuses her of adultery. He accuses her of incest. And, adultery was seen as a big, big treason back in those times. Why? Because, if the queen is sleeping with someone else, that would just might, you know, affect the purity of the bloodline of the monarchs, you know. So it was, the queen's chastity was a big, big issue in those times. So eventually, because of this treason, she was beheaded, literally. And uh, this minister in the court of Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell. Now, don't confuse him with Oliver Cromwell, the Protestant that is to come. We are going there. So this is Thomas Cromwell, right? Is also quite an assistant to instigate the king against Anne Boleyn. So, Thomas Cromwell, he instigated the king against Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn, before her death, she had produced a daughter, and that daughter was Queen Elizabeth I, who was to become the monarch after King Henry VIII's death. So imagine all of this fuss over having a male child, a male heir, and ironically, a female had to come on the throne. So, it was a conspiracy of circumstances. Queen Elizabeth I had to be on the throne, right? So, what after? So, we have spoken about two wives thus far, Catherine of Aragon and then Anne of Boleyn. And then later, after Anne Boleyn was beheaded, uh, King Henry VIII, he married Jane Seymour, who died in 1537, soon after having produced a son, who later, became King Edward VI, right? And Jane Seymour, obviously, we know she died in childbirth, so she was not beheaded. And then next came Anne of Cleves. The king also gets, or he grows out of love for her, and the marriage is therefore annulled. So another separation, another divorce, annulment of marriage. And because also 6 months down the line, 6 months after the marriage was not consummated, and later Anne Cleves became his sister. It's a very twisted history, I tell you. So later came Catherine of Howard, also accused of high treason, and she was executed in 1542, another wife beheaded. So last was Catherine Parr, and this Catherine Parr, she outlived the king, because the king died at the age of 55 in the year 1547, and she was his widow, Catherine Parr. So she was the one who survived, literally. So 6 wives, a very controversial love story. And when I was watching a documentary on King Henry VIII, I felt so sorry. He started off as a good guy, and then later he got injured, and he had some terrible injury in his leg. He could not even walk properly later in his life, and he grew in weight. He was um under a lot of pressure for not having a male heir, and then there was this constant shifts in his wives, one after the other. He was not destined for love. That is how I saw this guy. He wasn't a bad guy, but then circumstances made him that. And for everybody to see what exactly happened in his life, I have put in a documentary for you to watch. I will play a little bit of it, so it captures your interest. And don't worry if you are unable to see the video. The PPT will be shared with you later, and you'll be able to see it on your own.
This is the story of a royal court that changed the world. Above it all, Henry VIII, the tyrant king. He was brutal, he was ruthless. This is the story of a royal court that changed the world. Above it all, Henry VIII, the tyrant king. He was brutal, he was ruthless. He was probably the most selfish king we've ever had. A paranoid despot obsessed with treason.
This was a reign of terror. He made people very aware of every execution.
A religious fanatic who rebels against his church.
He believed that what he wanted was what God wanted.
To prosper in his shadow takes guile and audacity. But no one is ever safe.
You never knew from one day to the next whether you'd see the next dawn.
This program is made possible
So
in
it
part
is
by contributions.
almost an hour-long documentary, highly recommended, very interesting, very gripping. The whole story of Henry VIII is actually very controversial, and it is worth a watch. And a contemporary writer, Hilary Mantel, has even written books on this period. The Wolf Hall, it's actually the Thomas Cromwell trilogy. Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, and The Mirror and the Light, which has, Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII as characters, and you get a glimpse of the life of the Tudor times when all of these incidents were actually taking place. So it's very interesting to read this trilogy. And if you ever get time, I recommend these books, this trilogy specifically. And also, if you are willing to watch this movie, The Other Boleyn Girl, this is also about Henry VIII, Henry VIII's court, and this whole episode, how, Anne Boleyn, she gets beheaded, this whole controversial episode. It captures all that. So it is, again, a very interesting movie, and I think it's available on Netflix. This will be all for today. And in the next session, we will be taking Tudor dynasty after King Henry VIII. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you, Aishwaria. Just amazing. I am learning every time with you. I'm very happy that you came back again.
Thank you, Your Highness. I'm really happy to be back too.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all the people who were present today. And I thank the King Kelly, who is also with us today. Thank you so much, Your Majesty, for being with us. And
very much, Your Majesty. I did not know he was here. So thank you so much for being with us.
Here, probably he can say something, just greeting our family. Your Majesty.
Aloha kakahiaka, good morning from Hawaiian Islands. I enjoyed your class. It was very informative. Again, history is someone's understanding of what they feel history was. It's written to give them the very best outlook as well as the worst outlook. One of the queens that I think you should also study was Queen Mary of Scotland, who also who was the older cousin, the first cousin born, who would have been Queen of England. But the Queen Elizabeth back then, the younger, was fixated in destroying Queen Mary of Scotland. And Queen Mary, in her own way, tried to unite and with Ireland and so forth. And the English government sided with the Spaniards, because the Spaniards had a lot of gold and ships and what have you. So if you go through the history, and they talk about Wycliffe and all these wonderful poets, and I really enjoy them throughout my studies. And I found that when I deviated from that, I learned completely different historical events, especially with the events between the the Protestants and the Catholics. It became a huge war back then of great discriminatory measures, and the Catholic Church was instrumental in sitting the monarch of England, and they had to pay allegiance and homage to the Catholic Church in order to be a king or a queen. But the Catholic Church also went out and got those that they could mold and manipulate within. So there's a lot of dark history of England, of all the beheading. When we spoke of the beheading, I hope you went deeper to find that those those beheaded were those who fought against the tyranny, that did not believe fully in a Catholic regime of holding things together. And they fought against that simply because in their spirit they felt was wrong. So, and King Henry VIII was very disillusioned because rightfully he knew he wasn't the rightful heir. So you go through the history of that, you'll find there's a lot of disjointed stuff there. And great authors like Shakespeare and et cetera, where they because with so much chaos, and you talk about the Renaissance, et cetera, so much chaos and problems, they said, I need to change the whole mindset and create beautiful love stories. Romeo and Juliet came from many other things. So just be aware that the history is far in depth and deep. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you for being here.
Thank you, Majesty, for adding in those very inquisitive points. That was very informative. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And,
my pleasure.
And I also look forward to your presence in the coming sessions as well. And I'm very happy to be back.
I'm glad to have you back, and welcome again.
Thank you so much, Your Majesty. So I'll see everybody again next Thursday, same time, with the same link. So all the students, I do wish to see you. Please don't miss the classes. It's important. All right. So this side, I'll say goodbye. Good night. And I'll see you soon again, everybody.
Aloha. Hello, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. It was a great session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye and have a nice